Under the pale autumn light of Beijing, inside the marble-lined press hall of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, cameras clicked to life. Rows of journalists leaned forward as Guo Jiakun, the calm and deliberate spokesperson for the ministry, stepped up to the podium. Behind him, the crimson and gold emblem of the People's Republic glowed faintly against the polished wood backdrop. The date was October 9th, 2025, and once again, the war in Gaza had found its way into the heart of global diplomacy. Guo began to speak in measured Mandarin, his tone carefully calibrated, neither fiery nor detached. China hopes that a permanent and comprehensive ceasefire will be achieved in Gaza as soon as possible, he said. His voice carried through the room, precise and deliberate. We must effectively alleviate the humanitarian crisis and ease regional tensions. China hopes that a permanent and comprehensive ceasefire will be achieved in Gaza as soon as possible to effectively alleviate the humanitarian crisis and ease regional tensions. China advocates respect for the principle of Palestinian governance of Palestine and promotes the implementation of the two-state solution and is willing to work with the international community to make unremitting efforts toward a comprehensive, just and lasting settlement of the Palestinian question and the achievement of peace and stability in the Middle East. For the Chinese press corps, it was a familiar cadence, the diplomatic language of restraint and balance. But behind those carefully chosen words lay a deeper signal. Beijing was not merely reacting, it was positioning itself as an arbiter of stability in a conflict that had, for months, divided the world. This was the first official Chinese response since Israel and Hamas agreed on the initial phase of the Trump-brokered Gaza plan, an accord that Washington hailed as a first major step toward lasting peace. The plan's first stage, involving the suspension of offensive operations, the release of hostages and prisoners, and coordinated humanitarian access, had drawn cautious praise from across the Middle East. Yet it was China's reaction that drew special attention, precisely because of its long-standing ties to both sides and its evolving ambition to reshape global diplomacy. Beijing's statement was not a simple endorsement of the American-led process. It was, instead, an assertion of principles, the principle that Palestinians should govern Palestine. That line, repeated twice in Guo Jiakun's remarks, echoed the enduring Chinese view that sovereignty and non-interference remain central to any peace arrangement. To Chinese policymakers, Gaza was not just a battlefield. It was a test of legitimacy, of who gets to decide the fate of a people. Over the past year, as the conflict deepened, China's involvement had quietly grown. It hosted dialogues among Arab League envoys, maintained channels with the Palestinian Authority, and even offered humanitarian aid shipments via Egypt's Rafah crossing. Beijing's diplomats had also worked through the United Nations to push for a comprehensive, just and lasting settlement. Those phrases now found their way again into Guo's statement, an unmistakable signal that China sought not to follow Washington's lead, but to share and perhaps shape the stage. The timing of this press conference was also significant. It came just 24 hours after US President Donald Trump announced that Israel and Hamas had finalized phase 1 of his 20-point Gaza peace plan. The White House claimed it had secured mutual commitments on hostage releases and a monitored withdrawal of Israeli forces from parts of northern Gaza. Within hours, other world capitals began responding. Cairo and Doha welcomed the step. The European Union called it tentatively hopeful, and Moscow urged caution. Beijing, characteristically, waited a full day and then spoke with purpose. Guo Jiakun's message was not framed in slogans or emotion. Instead, it wove 3 layers of meaning: a humanitarian appeal, a geopolitical balancing act, and a philosophical statement about sovereignty. China advocates respect for the principle of Palestinian governance of Palestine, he said again, stressing the phrase with deliberate precision. The choice of words was not accidental. In diplomatic terms, it was a quiet rejection of any arrangement seen as imposed from outside, including, implicitly, the heavy American hand in the peace process. But Beijing's message did not end in criticism. Guo's closing lines were aspirational. China, he said, is willing to work with the international community to make unremitting efforts toward a comprehensive, just and lasting settlement of the Palestinian question and the achievement of peace and stability in the Middle East, that in itself was a declaration, not of dominance, but of endurance. Unremitting efforts. The phrase suggested patience, consistency, and the long game that defines Chinese diplomacy. Outside the hall, international correspondents began filing their reports. To many, the statement sounded like a call for multilateralism, a counterweight to the transactional style of Trump's diplomacy. Yet others saw it as a sign that Beijing was ready to expand its influence across a region once considered the near-exclusive domain of American power. For decades, China's role in the Middle East had been mostly economic, securing energy supplies, building infrastructure, maintaining a cautious neutrality. But by 2025, as conflicts converged from Gaza to the Red Sea, that posture had begun to shift. China's Belt and Road Initiative had already tied its fate to the ports of the Mediterranean. From Haifa to Port Said, from Beirut to Aqaba, Chinese companies had invested billions. Stability in Gaza, therefore, was not just a moral stance, it was a strategic necessity. Each flare-up threatened trade routes, delayed shipments, and complicated Beijing's energy calculus. But more than that, the Middle East had become a testing ground for China's emerging global security initiative, an alternative vision of peace based on dialogue rather than coercion. The 2025 Gaza crisis, then, had become a theatre of overlapping narratives. The US seeking a legacy of mediation, Europe seeking humanitarian relief, and China seeking a role as a responsible global power. And at the centre of it all, millions of Palestinians struggling to survive amid bombardment, displacement, and hunger. As Guo spoke, the statistics behind his calm words told their own story. Over 67,000 Palestinians had been killed since the war began, according to humanitarian monitors. More than 90% of Gaza's population had been displaced. Hospitals functioned at minimal capacity, water supplies had collapsed, and the power grid was a memory. China's call for a permanent and comprehensive ceasefire was at its core a reflection of that reality, an acknowledgement that any political arrangement would be meaningless without immediate relief for civilians. In the following hours, state media amplified the message. Xinhua News published a headline declaring China supports ceasefire and Palestinian self-governance. CCTV broadcast the full soundbite, subtitled in English and Arabic. On Weibo, users debated the meaning of Palestinian governance of Palestine, some framing it as a call for recognition of full statehood, others interpreting it as symbolic solidarity. Diplomats in Beijing, however, understood it differently, as a reaffirmation of China's non-intervention principle at a time when global powers were once again testing its limits. The foreign press soon connected the dots. China's statement came just as its special envoy for Middle East affairs, Jun, was reportedly preparing to visit Cairo and Amman to discuss coordination with Arab partners. Sources hinted that Beijing had also engaged in back-channel communications with both Israeli and Palestinian officials, urging restraint. In that context, Guo's words were not mere commentary. They were part of a choreography of quiet diplomacy. Analysts noted that China's approach to the Gaza crisis had followed a familiar rhythm: condemn escalation, call for dialogue, offer humanitarian aid, and invoke the two-state solution. But this time, the tone carried more weight. The Trump administration's peace plan, though polarizing, had created an opening. For Beijing, that opening could allow it to present itself as both a critic and a partner, willing to engage but unwilling to concede moral ground. The two-state solution remains a cornerstone of China's foreign policy, enshrined in countless communiques and reaffirmed at the United Nations. Beijing has long recognized the state of Palestine within the 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital. It has supported resolutions calling for international recognition while maintaining diplomatic ties and trade with Israel. This duality, principled yet pragmatic, defines its Middle East posture. At a deeper level, the statement also reflected China's growing sensitivity to domestic opinion. The images from Gaza, the rubble, the children, the hospitals, had stirred emotion across Chinese social media. Nationalistic influencers framed Beijing's stance as proof that China, unlike the West, stood on the side of justice. In official circles, this narrative aligned neatly with the message of community of shared destiny, a phrase President Xi Jinping often uses to describe a world led by cooperation rather than confrontation. In Washington, meanwhile, the reaction to China's statement was cautious. The US State Department welcomed all nations' support for peace, but added pointedly that the Trump plan remains the most credible pathway to stability. Privately, American officials viewed China's comments as a subtle challenge, an attempt to claim moral high ground without assuming real risk. Yet others in the US administration acknowledged that Beijing's involvement could help ensure that the ceasefire held, especially through its influence with Iran and Qatar. Indeed, China's leverage in the region is not military but economic, and that may be its greatest strength. As a top buyer of Middle Eastern oil and a growing investor in post-conflict reconstruction, Beijing wields incentives that neither bombs nor sanctions can match. When Guo Jiakun spoke of working with the international community, it was understood that China's contribution would be built not on troops or weapons, but on trade, aid, and diplomacy. By nightfall, the global headlines reflected the balance of reactions. The New York Times described Beijing's stance as measured but meaningful. Al Jazeera called it a calculated embrace of Palestinian sovereignty. Reuters wrote, China backs permanent Gaza ceasefire, urges respect for Palestinian self-rule. For a statement lasting less than a minute, its ripples were vast. Inside diplomatic circles, one question lingered. Was China positioning itself for a larger mediating role, perhaps even a seat at the next round of peace talks? Officials in Cairo and Doha believed so. They pointed to China's success in brokering the Iran-Saudi normalization in 2023 as evidence of its growing credibility. Beijing can talk to everyone, one Arab diplomat said. That's something Washington can't always do. Still, the road ahead remains uncertain. While the ceasefire agreement under Trump's plan marks a fragile pause, mistrust between Israel and Hamas runs deep. Israeli leaders, under pressure from hardline factions, insist that demilitarization must precede reconstruction. Hamas, for its part, demands full withdrawal and international guarantees. Amid those competing demands, China's insistence on comprehensive and permanent peace sounds idealistic, yet it reflects a truth many diplomats now share. Temporary truces no longer suffice. In the coming weeks, the world will test whether the ceasefire holds and whether the humanitarian corridors promised under the plan actually open. Beijing's influence may quietly shape both outcomes. It has pledged new aid shipments through Egypt, offered technical support for rebuilding water systems, and invited Palestinian officials to a future development forum in Shanghai. For China, these are not acts of charity, but of strategy, gestures that reinforce its image as a global stabilizer at a time when Western credibility is fraying. And yet, amid the diplomacy, the human toll remains the center of gravity. In refugee camps stretching from Khan Yunis to Rafah, families wait for food, for news, for an end. Each declaration of peace must be measured against their reality. Guo Jiakun's call for a lasting settlement resonates only if those lives change. Beijing, for all its rhetoric, knows that credibility abroad depends on compassion made tangible. As the press conference concluded, Guo bowed slightly and left the podium. The hall fell silent except for the shuffle of reporters gathering their notes. Outside, the city moved at its usual pace, traffic, commerce, routine. But for those listening beyond Beijing, the message lingered. In the careful language of diplomacy, China had entered the conversation not as a bystander, but as a participant, one that believes patience can be power and restraint can be strategy. The Gaza ceasefire, fragile, partial, and uncertain, now carries with it the weight of many capitals. Washington claims ownership. Doha and Cairo claim credit, but Beijing, in its quiet way, claims something subtler, moral symmetry. It does not dictate terms, yet it insists on principles. And as the war's survivors look toward an uneasy peace, those principles may yet shape the contours of what comes next. In the end, China's statement, Palestinians should govern Palestine, will be remembered less as a soundbite and more as a signpost. It reminds the world that the struggle over Gaza is not only about borders or bombs, but about identity and agency. Whether that vision becomes reality depends on forces far beyond any one press conference. But for now, in the echo of Guo Jiakun's calm delivery, China's position stands clear. Peace must be permanent, governance must be legitimate, and justice must be shared.